Hello and welcome to the final weekly MTG of 2024. And of course, we saved a doozy for the last one.
To say the least.
To say the least.
No news here. Click away.
So, yesterday, we dropped the latest banned and restricted announcement. And it was a lot. There were a number of cards on here. But, you know, unique to this one, we unbanned a lot of stuff, especially in Modern. So we're going to talk about all of the cards, both banned and unbanned, throughout this show. To do that, we've got Carmen and Dan here.
Hello.
And we're going to spend the whole show talking about the announcement we made yesterday. We're going to answer your questions. We're going to talk through every card, like I said, banned and unbanned. We'll talk through every format, whether there were changes or not. And we'll answer a bunch of your questions. So we're going to get to questions in a little bit. But when we do get to questions, it always helps me to tag at Magic. And don't do it yet. I'm not really looking for them just yet, but we'll get to them. So we're going to kick things off. We're just going to start.
We're
just going to go. And obviously the big news was Modern. So before we start talking about individual cards, this was a really big announcement for Modern. Talk to us a little bit about how you were viewing Modern coming into this announcement and what your overall approach was.
I think things were just in a really rough spot overall. It was something where it felt like players were generally pretty unhappy. Obviously, the metagame was not in a very good place. Red-White Energy was everywhere, and the One Ring in particular was something where we had just seen its meta share rise since the last time that we were here a few months ago, and we knew that we were going to have to take some big swings to get it to a place both to make it more balanced and to earn back a lot of player sentiment, right?
Yeah.
We knew there were a lot of upset players, and we do actually care, right? Saying you can Google us is funny, but we were players first before we were here. We care a lot about this, and we want to make sure that players are having fun.
Yeah, I think Modern over the last year or so has ebbed and flowed, but overall trended a little bit downward according to like sentiment, what the metagame looks like, what archetypes are viable. You know, we had Nadu we had to take care of. We had some black-red Evoke decks that were terrorizing before that. It just hasn't been a very happy place. You know, we've tried our best with the bans that we've enacted over the last year or so, but it definitely got to the point where we felt like that wasn't going to be enough this time. Maybe taking care of certain cards that we're going to talk about in a little bit can move the metagame into a little bit of a better spot, but I think we all felt that, and the community spoke to, it just needs a jolt. It needs, what are those paddles you put on somebody? Yeah, a kickstart, I don't know. Paddles. Yeah, that's what we needed to do to Modern, and I think hopefully we did that.
All right, well, let's start by looking at the ways in which we tried to resuscitate the format. First, obviously, is the One Ring. We talked about this card during the last announcement. We didn't do anything at that point, but it was clearly on our radar. We took action now. Carmen, you mentioned we saw the metagame share rise with this card. Talk about the One Ring.
Right, so the One Ring is a card last time that we were here talking with you about our decision to preserve its spot in the metagame. We recognized that it propped up a lot of strategies that otherwise might struggle a lot with the One Ring.
Yeah.
These are things where we care a lot that Modern is not just a two-deck format.
Yep.
It's an eternal format where you have, 30,000 cards or something legal, and we want to make sure that more of those cards can be played with in one way or another, and it was a pretty big risk for us to preserve it, but we thought it was a worthwhile risk. And we're going to speak more to unbans later on, but us wanting to make sure that different archetypes are viable for different kinds of players, basically anyone can be a Modern player is important to us. And that was a lot of our goals with the One Ring, but especially as we saw it just get incorporated into more and more of the decks that were already the top decks, it became apparent pretty quickly that this couldn't go on.
Yeah, I think when Boros Energy started really adapting the One Ring, that was a pretty big red flag.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, when we were speaking about the ring last time, we were taking care of the bird in the room. Essentially, we knew Nadu had to go. So we also had Grief at that point. That felt like a pretty sizable change and shift to the metagame. At the time, right, the ring hadn't been quite adopted into the Boros Energy shells, and it also just wasn't clear what the format would do having no Nadu to deal with. It's become abundantly clear, right, after now Boros Energy has the top spot and also plays 4 copies of the One Ring, that it was just its time to go. It's that risk that we took last time didn't go in the direction we thought, but we're taking care of it today.
Yep.
All right. Now, speaking of energy, there's a, Amped Raptor is the most obvious. It has energy pips right on the card.
Right.
But there are energy decks that play all 3 of these cards. So what was your approach to thinking about Boros Energy in this announcement?
So when it comes to Amped Raptor in particular, this is one where it's a very unique announcement here, right? You've kind of already alluded to the fact that we've changed, 7 cards legality in Modern at this point, or at least in this particular announcement. And every single card you add to a list like this adds a degree of uncertainty to how the metagame is going to shake up. And something we were fairly worried about was over-nerfing the Boros Energy deck and punishing players who might have worked really hard to collect the cards for the energy deck, and all of a sudden, say we were to ban multiple cards from the deck or maybe just completely take it out at the ankles, those players would be upset and maybe feel alienated going, oh, well, artifact decks are cool, but my energy deck isn't cool anymore. That was something we wanted to avoid, especially as we're powering up a lot of other macro archetypes.
Okay.
Yeah, we literally wrote 6 different cards on the board from Boros Energy when we were having our meetings to try and determine, what to do. Once we kind of landed on a set of unbans, we kind of came back and we're like, well, we want a softer touch here. We don't want to completely invalidate the energy deck. You could hit multiple cards from it, or maybe something that's a little bit faster out the gates, like Guide of Souls. But we wanted to damage the energy shell, make it a little weaker. And we didn't want to hit cards that could viably go into broader non-energy strategies. And so we did focus on one of the energy cards instead of something like Flage or a Johnny or Ocelot Pride, and ended up that Amped Raptor was probably one of the more cards that would hurt the archetype just a little bit. Not clear exactly how much, but I mean, it's also losing the ring like we just said, and even another card that we'll talk about in a minute.
Yeah. Okay, so the goal was to, we'll say, injure the energy deck, not completely take it out.
Yep.
Right. Something that Dan alluded to is having 6 energy cards on the board. We actually spent multiple weeks talking about this. I know I created a thread in Teams. We had multiple meetings about this. We had flow charts by the end of it that were just, okay, if we make this set of unbans, then I think we are supposed to ban this from energy. If we decide that we don't think unbans are a good idea, I think at one point we were looking at hitting 2 cards from it.
Yeah.
And to that end, I do want to say that I don't think that it is a non-starter for us to keep attacking energy. If it looks like the deck is still too strong, this isn't us saying we aren't willing to take further action against it, or we're only willing to take a light touch.
Yeah.
It's us trying to work more incrementally, especially with an announcement this big, where in a lot of ways we're just going in blind as to how it's going to shake out.
Yeah. Yeah. So talk about that a little bit, because we're going to get to the unbans in a bit, but it seems like there was a lot of calculus mixing and matching the unbans and the bans. So that went over the course of several weeks here?
Right. That was something where a lot of individual cards kind of got brought up by people where, I'm not going to call out individual people, but each card over some amount of time had its own champion. I know personally I've been a really big Green Sun Zenith fan for a long time and have played it in Legacy a bunch. But at a certain point, someone in one of the meetings said, what does it look like if we actually just take a few shots at once? Because we know that a lot of players feel like the big way that we are trying to change Modern at this point is through Horizon sets, and it matters a lot to us that is not true. And so this is one of the ways that we at Wizards actually have the power to introduce new archetypes into Modern, is by kind of questioning our priors, right? Where I think Dan did a really good job of summarizing this in his article, where we know that Modern is a different format at a different power level than when a lot of these cards were banned, right? We saw the Bloodbraid Elf and Jace the Mind Sculptor unban go over really well because Modern was in a different place when those cards became legal again. And so kind of taking a more holistic view of the ban list was something that we really prioritized because we just had the luxury to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it was the right time to do it. Maybe we could have experimented a little with a little bit more speed, but when you all are talking about how the format isn't fun or it's not what you love anymore, that really is something we take to heart, and we try to use the tools at our disposal on bannings and bannings to address some of that. Maybe now, I mean, I don't want to keep previewing our spicy section, but yeah, I think we're really sympathetic to just the tone, and if people aren't having fun, it's our job to do something about that.
Yeah. I mean, previewing it's all pretty much connected. So we're gonna reference stuff, but let's talk about Giganta. And companions overall. So Giganta got banned in Modern and also Pioneer. The latest in a long line of companions to get hit. What precipitated the change with Giganta here?
So it's the second most played creature in both formats according to our data, which is a little bit of an alarm bell. We hit the literal most played card in Modern as the One Ring. So we kind of look down the list, and also I think the overall tone of it's not an interesting deck building experience. Like a lot of the companions require you to do something with your deck. You have to play all odds or evens or cards that cost 2 or less or whatever it is. Those are fun deck building challenges. A lot of people will build their decks in Pioneer or Modern and just go, oh look, I'm playing red or green. I have no double pip cards. Free sideboard card.
Why would I play Liliana of the Veil when I could simply not?
That's probably another calculation. Your deck is one off, like you have Seasoned Pyromancer in Modern. You're like, if I just put Fable the Mirror Breaker in instead, I get Giganta. Okay, great, I'll do that. So it's kind of like an oops, I get an extra card deck building condition rather than a let me try to do this, which kind of goes against the spirit of what the companion text is intended to do. And that, along with its large metagame share, it's not a fun piece of deck building. It adds a couple percentage points in a couple games every so often. It's not like you see them summoning Giganta from the sideboard every game, but when it does happen and you both are top decking, it feels pretty terrible that they just got this free piece of cardboard for no work in deck building. And so I think for those reasons, we were ready to hit it. We're excited to also take a couple percentage points off of Energy's win rate. Like we said, we don't want to nuke it into the ground, but taking a couple percentage points off is kind of the goal. It should do that a little bit. It's not as big a problem as in Pioneer, but guess what? We're not going to stop printing new Magic cards that have 2 red pips in them or whatever. So it just will become a problem, we believe, and we thought now was a good time to hit it, despite Pioneer being in a relatively healthy place after the last set of bans.
And in a lot of ways, I think it's something that I'd refer to as more of an environmental issue than a rate one. So Luris is an example of another companion that we've had to ban because it was just too strong.
Yeah.
Right, that was one that we saw adding a ton of percentage points in a bunch of different matchups, with most of the deck building costs being play the cards that are already the strongest ones. And a lot of Giganta's issue is that it makes deck building exploration a lot less fun for a bunch of players, and Pioneer is actually a great example of this, where even though there is not a deck that is as dominant as, say, Boros Energy, which you could ascribe a lot of the blame in Modern for Giganta showing up, in Pioneer it's just that it shows up a ton of different places, and especially as we balance cards for Standard in a world with Llanowar Elf, something that we are doing is finding ourselves putting more pips on cards to make you able to cast your 3-drop on turn 2 a little bit less consistently as a balancing knob, but that hurts their viability to show up on Pioneer, which is somewhere we want players to feel empowered to try out cool new stuff.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. Okay. Our nice little side jaunt through Pioneer there. Let's go back to Modern and talk about the unbanned cards. These are some doozies, so we're gonna take them one by one. Let's start. There's a lot of conversation about what's the most powerful card unbanned, but I think Mox Opal and Faithless Looting are certainly sort of 1 and 2 in people's minds of the most powerful cards. Let's start with Mox Opal and the impetus for unbanning that one.
So this is the scariest one to unban. At least from where I'm sitting, this is the one that I think introduces the most risk and fundamentally alters the way that games of Modern work by the largest margin, right? There's some of Faithless Looting does something at a high rate, but there are other cards that kind of do that. Cards that just put you up a mana for no cost is just completely changing how games of Modern work in a really big way. So this is one that we think is a swing for the fences, and is us really trying to say, we are listening, and we know people really look back fondly on Mox Opal. I know before I worked for Wizards in my coverage days, artifact decks with Mox Opal were easily the decks that I most consistently saw completely foiled out.
Yeah.
People truly love these sorts of decks, and I think a lot of the community reception to this just in the last day or so shows with all the different kinds of 5-0 lists that we see with Mox Opal, it is very strong, and we aren't positive it will work out long term, but we do think players have a lot of fun with this.
Yeah.
And it really is worth trying to make it work, because ultimately I think one of the problems that Modern had previously with our approach to kind of just let's ban Grief and Nadu, see what happens and so on, is I think we lost sight a little bit of fun in the name of balance, and I really want to make sure that players are enjoying the games.
Okay. So when you're talking about you're not sure if this is going to work out, you're swinging for the fences, it seems like you all are intentionally taking a risk here, and you're open to the possibility that this might be something you have to reban.
Yeah, listen, I mean, we're taking 4 cards that had justifiable reasons one day in the past to be removed from the format and reintroducing them. That is a clear acceptance of some amount of risk. We chose cards like Carmen's alluded to earlier, we spent weeks, I think most of November actually, whether it was discussing in various messaging threads or in physical meetings, going through, almost flow charts of, what we wanted, what we thought would excite players the most, have some amount of risk, because every time we make a change to a format, every time we release a set, there's some risk involved. And we landed on these cards. I think Mox Opal is one of the most hype cards we could have removed from the ban list. It goes in so many different strategies. It doesn't just create kind of like one deck, right? There's Hardened Scales, there's Lantern Control, there's like Asmo Food, there's Breach decks. I mean, I don't even know if I can count how many decks there are. You said just from yesterday alone, we already have 5 different decks, 5-0ing the event with Mox Opals in them. But yeah, of course, this is a risk, and we're really excited to analyze what you all do, how you react, how the format metagame shapes up. We just also accept that Modern is a more powerful place than it once was. The introduction of these Horizon sets we'll go into it eyes wide open. It's definitely increased the power level of the format. There were cards banned a decade ago, 12 years ago. Mox Opal isn't banned that old, but yeah, what can be released? And I think we're accepting that this is a good time to do this. Let's run the numbers after we release some of these cards, and let's reevaluate for next time.
And something I want to touch on is that for the most part, the cards that we unbanned each represent a macro archetype that has fallen off pretty hard in the last few years. So artifact decks are something that we've really tried to add additional power to in Modern Horizons 2 and Modern Horizons 3.
Yeah.
I think Modern Horizons 2 did an okay job of that, right? We saw the Hammer Time decks pop up a little bit on the back of Urza Saga. But I would say we completely missed in Modern Horizons 3. I don't think we took any swings quite as big as Urza Saga, but a lot of counterplay has been introduced in that time as well. And this is something Dan touched on in his article, but Wrath of the Skies, Meltdown, these are things that even see play in Legacy sometimes as the best ways to counteract these strategies. So it's really easy to say, oh, this is strong because of this, but it's really hard to tell once people get to play sideboard games, once they have to play whole events, say the Challenges on Mikko on the weekends, the upcoming regional championships, once it's open deck lists with sideboards, etc. It is much harder to tell if these decks are simply going to be some of the stronger decks in the environment or more than the environment can handle.
Well, and that's what I think is really interesting about some of these unbans is the number of answers that we've printed in the time since. Wrath of the Skies, Meltdown being 2 recent ones, but we've also got safety valves like several of the forces that interact really positively with some of these
free
cards.
spells become the good guys now.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a couple of these. So let's talk about Faithless Looting next. You talk about macro archetypes. Faithless Looting is obviously pretty big for graveyard decks.
I think Faithless Looting is one of my favorite cards of all time, personally, but it's also just the type of thing that propped up a lot of decks that people really enjoyed playing. I think Arclight Phoenix might be one of the most beloved, best decks in the history of Modern. I remember that deck being fairly dominant in its time, but most people going, it's pretty cool though.
Yeah.
Right, and eventually, especially with Hogak and the like, Faithless Looting ended up going with it, but a lot of the questions around Faithless Looting to me boil down to what is fun to be strong right? So much of what we're doing is not just trying to make sure everything is winning exactly 50% of its matches all of the time, dual decks grizzly bears versus bear cubs, but a lot of it is much more in the vein of making sure that if something is strong, it is something that players are having fun doing, and whether it was Arclight Phoenix, Prized Amalgam, Young Pyromancer, Goryo's Vengeance, whatever it was Faithless Looting was doing, for the most part was cool, and we have introduced some really powerful hammers against stuff like that in the form of Endurance. You said we're going to talk more about free spells. I know that's something that has been backbreaking against Faithless Looting decks whenever I've tried to play them in Legacy, and seeing us taking the risk to see how it will go, I think is a worthy experiment here.
Yeah, the strategy we invoke to release like Mox Opal is pretty similar to the strategy that we're justifying Faithless Looting's unban. We haven't seen a lot of artifact decks in recent years, despite us actually trying to get them to work. So okay, let's get that sort of macro field of archetypes into Modern again. Sort of similar with Graveyard, though I think we've seen a bit more.
Goryo's Vengeance is
Goryo's Vengeance has
a
a decent chunk of metagame percentage. I don't know if you want to count the like blue-black Frog Oculus decks as a graveyard deck. Maybe they can toy around with this, but it doesn't seem like it slots.
I think 4 out of prelim yesterday. So I mean,
There you
maybe
go.
we'll see.
But it just hasn't been a large part of the metagame. Not like we want every deck to be a graveyard deck, but it just seemed like that was what's missing from Modern, and a thing that people longed for from long ago. So yes, Faithless Looting of course incurs some amount of risk, just like Opal, but we believe the tools, like we're pointing out how maybe cool these cards are to release in the format, but we're also being like, but these cards hate against it. And so it's kind of this interesting dichotomy, I think, of conversation where we're like, this is going to be so cool, but these cards are so good against it. So yeah, I do think we have the proper tools. We've had multiple years of answers created to problems that didn't exist. So now maybe the answers and problems can match.
In one of the meetings where we were talking about these unbans, Aaron Forsyth asked, so what do we think Faithless Looting does? And I snapped off, I think it mostly amass orcs too. That got a laugh. And then we actually talked about it. But it's just, there are a lot of things that interact with these cards in ways that I think is really hard to appreciate or even estimate what is going to happen. But what we are positive of is that it is going to let players build and justify building certain kinds of decks that they previously couldn't, which is really the goal of a lot of these bans.
Yeah.
That was an Orcish Bowmasters reference.
In case you didn't know.
All right.
Took me a second.
Next up, let's talk Green Sun Zenith. I think, if my memory is correct, this is the card that's been on the list the longest.
True. 2000.
Yeah, I think, was it right after Philadelphia?
It was with Blazing Shoal, I believe.
Yeah, it was pretty early on. In the
I think it was right after the debut Pro Tour.
Yeah. So long time on the ban list. What brought this one off?
Green creature decks, not at their best. I know Yawgmoth has shown up a little bit. It's not clear if Yawgmoth would be able to adopt that card. I know there have been at least one. There was at least 5-0 list.
5-0 list with Yawgmoth.
That didn't end up playing it. It's hard to tell if that is the quote unquote the truth or if it is just people trying out the new cards. But it not being able to get some of the more important cards in certain matchups, Agatha's Soul Cauldron, Yawgmoth, Orcish Bowmasters. Not clear if they're going to play it in big numbers. I know Amulet Titan is something else that is likely to adopt this, but they did also lose the One Ring, so I think the team is not positive if it is a net positive or net negative in terms of power level. It's likely more consistently explosive, but especially once you get into sideboard games, not having the card advantage engine with the ring. Anyway, some of this is wanting to make sure that as we pull the One Ring out of the format, some of the more resource-rich decks that it was propping up still get to exist. And this isn't us just kind of making all of modern games smaller than they used to be.
Yeah, if you look at what's getting played in the last half a year or so, you've got red-white cards, you've got blue-black cards, and then the only green you're really seeing is either from Amulet, which is, I mean, it's a green deck, but like it's not in the common sense of green. It's a Primeval Titan deck more than a green creature deck.
More than a green
and then you've got a bunch of Eldrazi variants, Eldrazi Tron or Big Tron or whatever that you kind of count as greenness, but there's not really a green creature. Like Nadu existed, we killed it, that was an outlier. But in the sense of something existing in a space that is toolboxy or just green creature.
Yeah.
Whatever.
We saw Elves 5-0
Heck yeah,
yesterday.
let's go.
We saw a couple, toolbox decks with Knight of the Reliquary and
The
that sort of
toolbox
thing.
stuff just kind of feels lost in a lot of ways too. That's something where
I didn't even think that was a thing that you could do anymore.
Right, I'm
but-
sure so many of the old heads, could be anyone remember the time sitting up at the hotel sweating over if you have room. Do you want to have the second Rex Age out of the
Yeah.
board? Like maybe it comes up. Maybe I want to have Loaming Shaman or whatever. Something cool in it. I don't think it's necessary.
What are your bullets? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think Modern's quite at that power level anymore for those exact cards to
Yeah.
be the ones, but having the ability to think about it is just really fun, and so much of this is just wanting to give players more options in deck building.
All right. Now, okay, so we talked about those three. The fourth one is a little bit different. We've talked about a lot of places the first three can show up.
In the interest of, sorry.
Just the format diversity.
Yeah.
Now, Splinter Twin. I think, if I recall correctly, at least you and I sat here in this studio and we're like, that's never going to happen.
yeah, I need to eat my badge.
Could not
Yeah.
be me. Could not be me.
No, it
Never
wasn't-
say never. Could not be
wasn't
me.
Carmen.
For fans of the show, I'm on record on this. Well, I don't even know how long ago it was. We were talking, and I said, it's just not going to happen. Just like very definitively.
Yeah.
I was so confident. But yeah, Modern's trajectory has changed my mind. It's just not. It just hasn't been that fun recently, and we're sad about that. And so, when you think about the time in the past that you enjoyed Modern the most, and these once infamous cards like Mox Opal, Green Sun Zenith, Faithless Looting, and maybe they were banned for appropriate reasons at the time. It's just a lot of what we've been reading and hearing and even feeling ourselves is just that people are kind of longing for the days of Modern's past. And it's really tough to think about the nostalgia of Modern without thinking about Splinter Twin.
Yeah.
It's just such an iconic part. It's the most memed card. And yeah, it was powerful back in the day. It won a bunch of tournaments, and I don't even know how many years have passed. It's been a long time.
It's been a while, yeah. And yeah, when you're talking about the memes, I mean, like, that's sort of a funny thing to say, but it's because it lives on for a lot of people, and it's something that they care about. The Green Sun Zenith has been banned for longer, but it didn't get memes. It didn't have people creating, framed sets of Deceiver Exarchs,
Yeah.
Pestermites, and Splinter Twin.
Shout out to all the people that had their banned cards in cases with
Yeah.
break in case of emergency on
And
them.
then
Saw a lot of
smashed
that.
them. I love seeing that too. That was great. And so, yeah, when you're talking about giving people something that they want and enjoy, I think that counts.
Yeah, I'm of two minds with it, where on a balanced perspective, Modern is fundamentally a very different format,
Yeah.
not just in terms of power level, but there are a bunch more free spells
Yep.
that can answer your opponent trying to Deceiver Twin you, or
Yep.
Exarch Twin you. And also, Dan touched on a point that I think is really important, and I think it is easy to just write something off as nostalgia, but in a lot of ways, I think we're really trying to approach Modern as an eternal format. We
Yeah.
want to make sure that we're approaching Magic's history with reverence in a lot of this and saying, you know what, that was cool. Why not? Why can't? And some of the reasons is it is too strong, and that is why we can't do it. There are cards that are still on the ban list after all. But making sure that we aren't just saying, no, that's history, that already happened, we're going to leave it there. We want players who engage with Modern to feel like they really are playing with something that is emblematic of the last, 21 years of Magic at this
Who
point.
knows? Time
And
is a
so
construct. Yeah.
finding opportunities to inject content from Magic's past is pretty important to us. And hopefully this BNR does a good job of signaling that we do care about that.
Yeah. All right, let's move on to Legacy. Legacy is the last format that we had any changes to, so we're going to talk about that. And then after we talk about Legacy, we're going to move to Q&A. So I've got some questions that we pulled off of social media over the past 24 hours. But as I said, if you have a question that you would like to ask on the stream, it helps me find it if you tag it at Magic. All right, let's talk Legacy. So 2 cards banned here, Psychic Frog and Vexing Bauble. Let's first start with the why these cards.
The Frog. Yeah, so we created this ban window in order to be able to observe sort of like the largest legacy tournaments that happen around the world. So there was a series of Eternal Weekend events. I think I'm hopefully not putting my shoe in my mouth, but they were all won by different strategies. I think we had an Artifact, Mystic Forge deck, we had Blue-Black deck, and we just had a sort of Nadu Breakfast, I think, win the last one, which that points to good things. But if you look a little step further, the format is still dominated by Blue-Black Reanimator, some Dimir Tempo style decks as well, both featuring the Frog. We took care of Grief last time in efforts to, knock some percentage points off of this Blue-Black Reanimator deck, which had taken just a huge chunk of the legacy metagame. Hoping that would do the job. Clearly the job is not done. So we are pretty interested in preserving, kind of like we were talking about Modern, we kind of want these macro archetypes to be part of the metagame, just maybe not as dominant part of one. So while we considered other aspects of the Reanimator deck, they felt more like they would possibly take the Reanimator just as a strategy completely out of the metagame if we hit Entomb or Reanimate themselves. They felt like too strong of a move. And so the removal of Frog ideally will remove the sort of fair game plan the Reanimator decks are allowed to play and kind of keep them in the Reanimator lane.
Okay. All right. What about Vexing Bauble? Vexing Bauble looks like a strange one to people who aren't familiar with the legacy format.
Yeah. We took this one out of Vintage last time we talked. What it was doing there is not quite the same as what it's doing here, but essentially the goal of Vexing Bauble was to stop unfair things from happening. However, in Legacy, the thing that stops unfair things from happening are like Force of Will, and this stops Force of Will. And so when we started to see at least 3 different sort of permanent-based combo decks using Vexing Bauble as sort of a proactive way to get their move off, whether that's Painter Grindstone or Mystic Forge and nonsense or whatever it is, that just felt like it was going against sort of what we needed to be true about Legacy. We don't want it to be just mono combo all the time. It should be pretty diverse, like we want that in all our formats. And this was stopping that from happening. It's a fairly new development, but we kind of saw the writing on the wall, like this is probably going to keep happening and be adopted by more and more decks. And it's really cheap to include. It has a buyout. If you don't need it, you can just cycle it for more cards.
Yeah.
So the opportunity cost was really low, and it sometimes also advances your artifact strategy while protecting you. So yeah, just too much coverage.
Yeah. Now there were questions, and here I'll dip my toes into some of the questions in chat. But I saw this online as well. There were questions like, hey, from the Legacy community, like, hey, you took this big swing with Modern. Why not take another big swing with Legacy? There are things that they think could come off the list in Legacy. Was there any consideration of that? Is that on your radar?
Well, I think when you're taking, Carmen did make this point earlier, when you're taking compounding changes, when you're making multiple changes, whether it be across formats or in a single one, each one introduces another percentage or two of uncertainty. And so we've taken a big swing in Modern here. We really would like to see that play out in the real world. Say it doesn't work out, right?
Yeah.
That's a possibility. We'll fix it. If we did that in both formats and neither of them worked out, like that's probably a worse situation to be in. I think we, with some confidence, made some changes to Legacy to push it into a better spot. It didn't seem as in a dire spot as in Modern as well. But totally think that, once we observe what happened with the Modern unbans, I think I stated in the article, this is kind of like a new set of philosophy. Like we're pretty interested in injecting content into these formats and making them a better place, a more happier place for you to play. And if it goes well, I think that completely opens the door for us to do this. Like, I don't think we're going to take everything off the ban list at once. I think we've talked about in previous streams why that's probably a bad idea. But slowly letting some cards through, I think is on the table for sure.
Yeah, I think, and to unpack some of the past talks that we've had about the Legacy ban list and unbans in particular, something that I think it was Ian Duke who might have first said this to me is we only get to push that button so many times. I know we get to make jokes about it. We thought we would never get to do Splinter Twin, but it turns out Modern has adapted to a point where that is not the case. I don't think Legacy is going to get to the point where we can entertain Mox Jet. right? A lot of the cards that are banned in Legacy are extremely, extremely banned. They're
Yeah.
that, or they're mental misstep, or something to that effect. So doing a bunch of cards at once is really cool, but it's almost something where I personally think you get more content and more versions of Legacy in a way that is interesting and fun to build decks in if it is a slower drip. I know
Okay.
Mind's Desire is one that I was internally a really big champion of after curating the Vintage Cube for a long time, and other people were on it. I'm not trying to take credit for all of it, but just citing that as an example, that was something that gave a good bit of content for a little bit. People started playing High Tide again. I think I have still seen some 5-0s with it in recent memory. Storm as well. I know there are some people who played a lot with that. And I think it is better long-term for the health of Legacy to dole those out one at a time. So some of those unbans don't get buried by, say, the more exciting ones than it is to just open the gates at once.
All right. Now, so we're going to move to the Q&A section, but it's sort of a natural progression because we haven't talked about Standard much. There were no changes in Standard. Dan, you wrote in the article a bit about Standard, but we have seen a number of questions about how you all view Standard right now. There's a lot of Dimir being played. Carmen, I know you were casting this past weekend. So let's talk about the Standard format and how you view that right now.
Yeah. One big tournament aside that has 40 some players. These large, sort of small, but like big marquee events that have a pretty limited amount of players do tend to coalesce into a few different strategies. There's just not a ton of players, and some of them are working together. There's these teams.
The groups is like 5 people, and if they land on the same deck, then that's 10% of the field is on one deck because one team decided Dimir was the deck.
We do try not to take too much stock in sort of that metagame distribution on the sort of 32-person events, 40-person events, or whatever, because it's not in a big enough sample size. So when we do look at the data from week to week on Arena and stuff like that, it's a much flatter metagame percentage. Yes, Dimir, Golgari, they still have good shares, but their win rates aren't particularly alarming. The Convoke or the Boros decks also have pretty strong representation and strong win rates. We can't remember the last time we talked about Standard philosophy, but we're really only interested in that one ban window per year.
Yeah.
And I think something pretty electric needs to be happening for us to act outside of that window. It's worth noting we did hit the red ley line in best of 1. It's just its own little format, and I think we haven't seen it also cause an issue in best of 3 normal Standard play. So yeah, while we've been thinking about it a little bit, nothing really surpassed our bar of needing to act outside of that once per year near the rotation cycle.
Right, and the things that people optimize for in best of 1 are different enough that we generally manage it in a different way than Standard.
Yeah.
We've talked about sideboard play a few times today, and that's obviously not a thing in best of 1. So it ends up being much more problematic there, especially when you're going in blind, you don't see deck lists, you don't know what's going to happen, and all of a sudden you're on the draw and someone has a ley line in play on the first turn and you're having a bad time.
Yep.
Very, very different animal, but just to echo what Dan said, we mostly want to, unless something very, very bad is happening, we want Standard players to know that whenever they collect cards for Standard, they're going to be good for at least until the rotation, unless, again, the water's already boiling, right?
Yeah. All right. Let's go back to Legacy for a second. We didn't talk much about Nadu, but I know Nadu was sort of on your list of cards to watch. Thoughts on Nadu?
So Nadu's one where there are 2 different kinds of decks in Legacy. One that, at least personally, I'm more tolerant of than the other. So there is the Cephalid Breakfast deck, which has been something between a real player and kind of a meme in Legacy for well over a decade at this point, that also uses Shuko, Cephalid Illusionist. This is a fairly normal play pattern in Legacy. And in that deck, a lot of the times, the way that Nadu interacts with that is, I'm going to draw 10 cards, pass on your upkeep, I'm going to draw 10 more cards, and you're probably dead over 2 turns.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily the best play pattern, but it is something that is more in line with what Legacy's been able to tolerate. There's some weirder play pattern stuff that we normally don't let you do in Legacy, because Legacy is sort of a no-holds-barred place where you get to play with Wasteland and Daze and Lion's Eye Diamond and so on. On the other side, there is a more combo-y than that version of Nadu that is closer to what we saw in Modern with a bunch of Gaia's Cradles. It's way more green-based. It also uses Spring Heart and Antuco to loop a bunch of cards out of its deck. And that is one that is taking 10, 15-minute turns, is very hard to manage the battlefield, is bad for playing in paper tournaments for logistical reasons. And that is something that is fairly problematic and has looked very good, but it is hard to tell if it is because it is new and people have not yet adapted to it, or if it is because it is truly that much stronger than what other people are doing. In the world where the Bant deck continues to dominate and show up a bunch, I don't think Nadu is long for this world. I'm not particularly protective of the card, but it is very hard for us to create new content for Legacy. So if it turns out that is more of an opt-in thing that happens sometimes, and Cephalid Breakfast is also happening, and they got a cool new card, then I'm more tolerant of it. But I would say it is not going to, there's not a very high burden of proof for us to show Nadu to the door.
All right. We have a slew of questions about why not unban this card? Why not unban this card? This card seems, specifically in Modern, this card seems less powerful than Mox Opal. Is it safe to unban? Rather than going card by card, and there are a number of people that have mentioned Deathrite Shaman, Jite, Birthing Pod.
Not to go card by card. Though.
Not to go card by card. We're not gonna address each card by card.
You're good.
But can you talk sort of generally? You talked a little bit about it with the flow charts. But talk about some of the discussion around cards that didn't make the cut and getting unbanned.
Yeah, again, the philosophy we were aiming for was kind of bring you back to a Modern you used to love, and also what cards can we release that kind of don't necessarily add to what the top strategies are right now, but also could go in many, many different spots. How many different Mox Opal decks can there be? Faithless Looting, same question. Green Sun Zenith, hopefully the same question. Splinter Twin, maybe just a couple. And that maybe we're among the most fun options. They're all different amounts of risk, right? And you could say there's some older cards. I think one of the ones we had talked about was Uma's Always Jite. It's probably not too risky, but it has a completely warping effect on creature combat. And once many of us have experienced this, you get one hit off of that Jite, you're like good to go. It's really tough to come back, and that's just not that fun. Also, how many different Jite decks are there going to be? Maybe it's a couple one-ofs and sideboards. I mean, it would be cool if a Stoneforge Mystic deck came back to the metagame, but we thought it was a tier below where we're at right now. I think it's totally worthy of the continuing conversation, and that's sort of the same argument we made for cards further down the list as well. I think we did talk about Birthing Pod. I can't remember how much credence we gave to Deathrite exactly. I'm just naming cards that you named. But yeah, we definitely, I don't remember how many cards are even on the ban list, but we took a good, like I said, most of November trying to think about the strategy we wanted to invoke. And I think we just landed on, there's some risk involved with the ones that we're releasing. We're accepting that risk. We think it's worth it in terms of the amount of gain, fun, nostalgia, and I don't know, Mox Opal, I don't think anyone expected. And when you wake up on Monday morning and you get this Christmas present under your tree that was like not even what you thought, but you're really excited about it, that's like a really good feeling we wanted to invoke. Yeah, I just thought expect the unexpected.
Yeah, and so much of it is, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I don't think a lot of those cards are even out of the question long term. We are trying to signal a different approach to how we're curating Modern, holding a lot of reverence for Magic's history. Umezawa's Jite is one that I think it might even be able to come back sometime, but it is possibly on the wrong side of maybe doesn't do that much in the format except make some people with small creature decks upset sometimes. So especially when we're bringing back Green Sun Zenith to try and encourage players to play some of the small ball stuff in Creature World, we don't want things that actively pressure against it at the same time. I don't know, we went really far down the list, and there, like, to give people some perspective, at one point I even made other people in the building talk about Dig Through Time, where it's just like, okay, gang, we we know this is too strong, but do
Yeah.
we know this is too strong? Let's have a conversation about it. And it is front of mind for us to actually think about what it is could come off long term and just trying to find the right places to do it.
And I'll note, like, this was also, I keep saying this, but the goal was sort of this whole messaging, this whole, last 2 days of us talking was sort of a recognition of the increased power level of Modern and sort of the reverence, as you keep saying, for sort of Modern's days of old, the nostalgia that we all kind of fell in love with the format a decade ago, and it's kind of evaporated a little bit. So we were focused on releasing cards that had been on the list for a while. We weren't really interested in entertaining the sort of the newer ones, Griefs or Furies or any of that kind of stuff. So we were definitely focused on, like, part of the strategy was to focus on older stuff that may be safe to release instead of, some of the newer stuff that we had removed.
Mm-hmm. All right, where'd it go? That was the question I was going to ask. Still on Modern. All right. So we've talked about the chance that we may have to reban cards if they don't go right. But what about the flip side of that? So this is the question. Is there a chance that green creature decks don't come back, they get further help from things like Glimpse of Nature or a Bowmaster ban?
Yeah.
Totally.
Glimpse of Nature was actually on our short list.
Yeah, it's sort of the same, sort of the same reasoning why we talked about Nadu a little bit earlier. Is just like glimpse turns often take quite a lot of time.
Yeah,
that's
right.
a pretty, it's fun for that person, but I wouldn't call it net fun.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know we've talked about fun a bunch of times.
He wouldn't. No, we wouldn't call it net fun. Okay.
See, exactly the point I'm trying to make is fun is subjective, but
Yep.
we have to kind of look at it holistically a little bit and make it like everyone's going to have a different definition of fun. But yeah, just the play pattern is not super ideal, and yeah, it wasn't on the this is going to excite a million people list. And we have to make that judgment too, which is quite subjective. There will be diehard fans of Elves and Glimpse, and hopefully Green Sun gives you a little taste of that. And yeah, if it's not strong enough and we still don't see real green creature decks, maybe that's next.
We'll see. Yeah, we're always looking at this stuff. We have a bunch of people who really like playing Modern. I know most of my own Magic collection is because I like to play Modern a lot. So these are things where, Glimpse on the short list, but kind of on the wrong side, like you said, of play pattern versus net fun that it could introduce to the format, even if the power level might actually be fine. We're not 100% sure, but like you said earlier in the show, there was a 5-0 list for Elves already in one of the deck dumps.
Yeah. All right. I have seen a number of questions about Commander, so some clarity on that. The Commander group is hard at work, doing their thing. They are not going to be, as of now, of course, we may figure out timing later, but so these BNR announcements are tied to tournament format. So that's why we've changed the timing to align more to our tournament schedule. And the Commander ban list is not necessarily going to be tied to that. So these BNR announcements, the ones where we announce the next time and we blah, 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 are not going to be the same as the Commander announcement. Now, we may come to find that the cadence works or whatever and bundle it all.
We're always learning.
We're always learning.
That's why we've changed things a couple times in the last year. So we're figuring stuff out.
Yeah, but the intention was never for any Commander bans or unbans to be tied to this announcement or the one in March. So we will, I know that group is hard at work. We don't have anything to announce on that yet, but certainly in 2025, we will talk more about that. Next up, let's see. Commander.
I hardly know her.
We've asked this question before, but it's certainly more relevant now than ever. Why not restrict the One Ring to one per deck rather than the ban? Go ahead.
Yeah, that was a definitely discussion topic during this most recent last month or so. Yeah, it's cool. It's flavorful. It does solve like, oh, there should only be one. There's only one in. Well, there's like I don't even know a dozen rings in the IP. But like anyway, there's one ring. I don't know how many rings there are.
There's one naughty.
But like
there's a whole poem about how many
it does
rings are, but
also
continue. Go on.
Ironically, the restriction does solve some of the play pattern issues where the player resets the burden counters. But One Ring is used in a decent chunk of Karn decks too, which now can find their silver bullet pretty easily. Modern is a primarily competitive format. I think two things. A, the messaging of just like it's 0 or 4 is much easier than it's 0 or 4 or 1 sometimes. But if you're entrenched into Modern, you'll probably be pretty up on the ban list and the intricacies of it. But also just like, I think people are kind of sick of being ringed. That you've gotten ringed for the last 18 months, and it's overwhelmingly the sentiment that card should go. And if it should go, not just kind of go. There'll be a percentage of games, if it were restricted, that come down to the player ripping that 1 of 1 ring, which is going to feel a little too probabilistic for, I think, a highly competitive format. So yeah, these are the reasons I think we chose the course of action.
Right, in Vintage, when there are a bunch of restricted cards, the emotional experience is so different, where it's like, I mean, they have 38 one-ofs.
Yeah.
They're going to draw some of them. That's just how it works.
Yeah.
And next game, they're going to draw some different one-ofs. When there's only one card in your deck that is a one-of, it is just so much different and can feel much, much worse. And that was something where I think, because of how many players feel a lot of animosity towards the One Ring, I think that would just even put a multiplier on what is already a negative feeling.
Yep. All right. Okay, I've seen a number of questions about Historic and Timeless. We didn't really spend any time on them in this. Any initial thoughts about Historic or Timeless? Those are primarily arena formats, not primarily. But
Yeah, I think a lot of our focus was on mainly Modern here, and we haven't really talked a ton about Timeless and Historic in the meetings we had, trying to get the Modern problem as solved as we could. So
We spent a lot of time on Modern.
Yes.
I know I keep saying we care, but we care.
Yeah, and the way, and so people at home know, the way this often works with the arena-only formats is the arena team has just mounds of data for the arena-only formats. It's literally the only data that exists, and we have it completely, and so the arena team flags when things reach certain thresholds, and there were no flags this time. I don't play Historic, but I play a lot of Timeless. I'll say Timeless is pretty much doing what it's supposed to be doing. I know there's some conversation around Dark Ritual, but otherwise, I think Timeless is fun. There's a lot of different.
Got to be a cool card to be strong, right? That's one of the ones that I feel so many people walk into their LGS and are just like, Dark Ritual does what?
Yeah.
Yeah, you play that format to do the
you do the
wildest things you can do, right? So
Yep.
that's just the wild.
It's the wild west, and that's how people like it. All right.
Words of my friend Abe. In Magic, sometimes bad things happen to you.
You need to experience the bad to appreciate the good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. Can the arena-only formats get bans outside of these windows? We'd like to not. We have in the past done arena-only announcements when they've been, very specific to arena-only formats. We did, and then of course Alchemy gets, adjustments to cards on different schedules, but we try to keep things on the schedule. And there have been a number of questions about scheduling. I've seen a few questions, especially with so much change in Modern. There have been questions like, okay, Modern's been in a bad place for a really long time. You've made a bunch of changes. We don't know exactly how this is going to go. Could we have a faster cycle to look at Modern? Any consideration there?
This new sort of cycle where I would say maybe, was it 2 announcements ago? We sort of locked into a certain cadence that we wanted to try. It was a new thing. Previously, we'd had a window after every set's release. We noticed that maybe a decent chunk of the sets don't impact a lot of our older formats that need the most maintenance, but also it's a scheduling nightmare, to be honest, with set releases, RCQs, RCs, Pro Tours, all your smattering of other types of tournaments, to try and disrupt the least amount of people's time and testing and events and planning as possible. So I'm not saying the current cadence is perfect or anything, but it was the thing that was going to avoid the most amount of disruption possible while still getting us in about a 3-month-ish time span to gather data. yes, sometimes we can read stuff on the internet and it is true that we should take action, but sometimes it doesn't reflect the same in the data, and it's just sort of like these little spheres of conversations. And so we do want to give ourselves ample time to collect enough hard data to act appropriately, but also there are times where, yeah, maybe 3 months is too long. And so I'm not saying we have a perfect system right now, but I think we're gonna keep playing, going forward with that until, yeah, maybe we'll come up with a better idea. But I think for now, until you hear further, we're going to stick to the aiming it right between the RC seasons.
All right. Okay, we're going to go with one more questions. We're just about out of time, and this one's directed directly at Carmen.
Yippee!
All right.
I'll drink our coffee.
So you've gone through a lot of the modern builds. You're a big modern fan. What is the best twin build? Please.
What's the best twin
What's
build?
the best twin build? We're on day 2 of the new format with twin.
Look, buddy.
What is the best twin
Here's
build?
the thing. We just banned, I was joking before the show, we just banned a red 2-drop from Red White Energy and a 4-mana non-creature spell. You can just add a brand new 4-mana non-creature spell that happens to be red or white, and then Fear of Missing Out from Duskmourn, which is a 2-mana red creature. I don't know if that's the best deck, but it's probably where I'd start.
Yeah. You got Village Bellringer. You don't need blue cards to make your twin deck go off.
I saw at least 4 different twin decks in my research yesterday, watching y'all play, and I was blown away by just the replacement, direct replacement for the energy deck. I was like, well, I don't know if this knocks enough percentage points off of what we were hoping, but yeah, FOMO plus twin, cool. Yeah. Village Bellringer, cool.
Honestly, I think it would be sweet. I mean, okay, so obviously it is too strong, it would not be sweet. But if the thing that is strong to do with Splinter Twin ends up being a standard card, come on.
Yeah.
Come on. We couldn't do that on purpose. That is sick. That is I think that's what a lot of people miss about Modern, is feeling like there are new things they can do outside of a Horizon set, and having something that hits the mark with something that's also old and familiar, like that.
Yep.
That's what Eternal formats are about. Come on. Come on.
Exactly. I will go with one last question. There are a bunch of questions about reprints for these cards now that they're unbanned. One, that's not a consideration. Generally speaking, we aren't like unbanning cards in order to get them in reprints, but it certainly moves them to the list, I would assume, of things to find to put in sets in the future at some point.
Yeah, I mean, we do look for opportunities to reprint cool cards, especially in Standard. It's always really fun when some old nostalgic card can be put into Standard.
Yeah.
But yeah, we came at this directly from a how to fix Modern standpoint, not from a what cards can we put in what products standpoint. So yeah, could we, will we, maybe, I don't know. But I think that wasn't like where our head was at the time of trying to figure out what cards to release.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, fair game now. We don't like to generally put banned cards in products.
Yeah.
So just naturally, I think maybe we'll look for places where those cards can fit.
Great.
I mean, in so many ways, I just think, I don't want people to think that we're just unbanning stuff for the sake of monetization or something like that. Like, this is something where it really is us trying to be player first with this sort of decision. So I don't know. I don't know everything that is coming out in the next however many years in the future we have locked in, but these decisions were made agnostic of any of that.
Yeah. All right. Well, that is our show for today and our last show for the year. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you to producer Sean. We cannot do this We cannot do this show without him. There are a lot of people who help out with the show, but producer Sean is the beating heart of this show and makes it happen every week. So big thanks to him as we end the year. Happy holidays to all of you. We're going to be back on January 7th, I think. Is that Tuesday? Math, maybe?
Hold on. We will
7th,
return
great.
January 7th.
When we will be talking Innistrad Remastered previews. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next month.